gentlemen, a good evening to all of you, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. My name is Shitish Kapoor. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all today to the R Douglas Wright Lecture. Before we begin, on behalf of all present, I acknowledge the elders, families and the descendants of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who have been the custodians and stewards of these lands for many generations. And in fact, I keep counting and trying to calculate, we're talking about 2,000 generations of stewardship, and that's quite an amazing number. I acknowledge that the land on which we meet today was the place of age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal, and that the local Aboriginal peoples have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of this university. And with that acknowledgement, it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture. And as I do that, let me first thank the Friends of RD Wright, who have been sponsoring this lecture since 1985. Particular thanks to John Coughlin and Bill Liu, who are with us this evening, and they are the ones who have been of force behind the continuity of this lecture. Now, this lecture has traditionally been funded by the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences, the Friends of RD Wright, Professor John Funder and Lady Wright, and I would like to particularly acknowledge the support from Lady Wright, because with her generous contribution we have been able to get new medals made for this lecture this time, so thanks for that. Now, as you can probably gather, that I was not fortunate enough to have met or studied under Hansi Wright, but I've certainly had the good fortune of speaking to many people who have. And what they've always spoken about, the passion that he had for causes and for ideas, and often the controversy that he was to generate. So it is only fitting then that the RD Wright lecturers are chosen to create opportunities to precipitate controversial discussion and to promote valuable and useful new ideas and technologies. So these lectures really are an opportunity then for the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Science to move outside of the confines of its usual daily discussions and to engage in some broader discussions that are going on either in the academy or in society at large. These are also, of course, for us an occasion to welcome back some of our great leaders of the past and some of our colleagues and alumni who have now left us and are happy to join us back in here again. I can't acknowledge all of you here today by name, but perhaps I should take this opportunity to acknowledge one of my own predecessors, Professor Jim Angus, who's with us here today, Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences, but perhaps notably quite like Hansi Wright, someone who has not only been a Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, but also subsequently a Vice Chancellor of our university, Professor David Pennington. So welcome to you, David. And I think I'm being informed. Yes. Judy? All right. Well, thank you so much for letting me know. My notes didn't tell me about that, but it is indeed a privilege to welcome you, and thank you very much for joining us here today. And thanks for letting me know. So with that, it is my pleasure now to introduce Professor Richard James, our Deputy Vice Chancellor for Academic and Undergraduate Affairs, who's also the Deputy Provost and a Professor for Higher Education, who will introduce our speaker this evening. Richard.
Thank you, Shitish, and it's an absolute honour and pleasure for me to welcome my colleague and friend, Professor Simon Marginson, back to the University of Melbourne and to be able to introduce his lecture this evening. But before I formally welcome you, Simon, I'd like to acknowledge that your dad's here, Dr. Ray Marginson, AM, who was Vice Principal of the University for something over 20 years, I believe, from the mid-60s onwards. It's great that you're here with us this evening, Ray. Simon is presently Professor of International Higher Education at the Institute of Education, University of London, where he's the Director of the Centre for Global Higher Education. Simon is simply a formidable scholar, so I'm not too sure how I can do justice to his record and contribution in the few minutes that I have. For nearly 3 decades now, Simon has specialised in social science research and scholarship in relation to higher education and comparative and international education in the context of globalisation. Simon is simply a prolific writer and publisher. Since 1992, he's published 26 books, and if you're doing your arithmetic, you'll be calculating that that's one per year. Many of them sole authored and jointly authored and edited collections. On top of that, Simon has produced goodness knows how many book-length commission reports during that period, as well as journal articles. I used to say, and it's quite true, that Simon was producing written work faster than I could read it. Between 1995 and 2013, he received continuous ARC large grant, discovery grant funding, which is again an extraordinary achievement for those of us who know how hard it is to win these grants. I remember one year he was successful in winning 2 ARC discovery grants, which was more than some whole universities achieved in that year, believe it or not. He is an active public and media commentator, and since he's been in the UK, we certainly miss his engagement with Australian higher education issues in the way that he did for so many years. Simon completed a BA at the University of Melbourne, a mediocre BA, I might say, his words, not mine, and during which period he managed to be editor of Farrago, and the editorship of Farrago has subsequently improved considerably, I must say. His first position was with the Australian Union of Students. He then worked for the Australian Teachers Federation in Canberra during the Hawke-Keating years, before, thankfully, moving into the academy and coming to the Centre for the Study of Higher Education here at the University of Melbourne in 1993, where I first met him. He was promoted to Reader and Associate Professor at Melbourne before going to a chair at Monash University and becoming the Director of the Monash Centre for Research in International Education in 1999. In 2000, he was elected a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences. I'm pleased to say that he returned to Melbourne as a Professor of Higher Education, came back to the Centre for the Study of Higher Education, and had a very fruitful period of his academic career whilst he was with us. In 2008, he was awarded the prestigious Woodward Medal in Humanities and Social Sciences for his work on higher education and globalisation. Simon is a deeply international scholar with work across East and Southeast Asia, North America and Mexico, Western and Eastern Europe, and most recently in India and Chile. In 2014, he received the great honour of being the Clark Kerr Lecturer on Higher Education at the University of California, Berkeley, the first non-American to ever deliver the Clark Kerr Lectures. What can I say about Simon's intellectual character? Well, he's an eclectic and encyclopedic scholar and an engaging speaker, as we will see this evening. His interests are wide-ranging and include education and social inequality, competition, markets and public goods, nation-states and the global society. I can say with certainty that Simon is a giant in the field of higher education research. There is literally no one better in the world, and he always has interesting perspectives to bring to debate. I don't think there's anyone better equipped to attempt to answer the question, how good are Australian universities? Simon, we nervously await your conclusion on that question. Welcome and thank you.
What a pleasure it is to be introduced by Richard after working with him for 12 years, and you know what a fine manager he was for me, I must say, and what a good intellectual and personal companion So that introduction gives me more than the usual pleasure. I want to thank Sheesh and John for the invitation. It's most generous, and I only hope I can do justice to the great name that's attached to the lecture. It's a pleasure to see David Pennington here, and I read about David while reading about Pansy, it was David that gave me my first job, and he was absolutely instrumental in my academic career. All that's happened since was the result of that doorway that he opened up for me and the support that he gave me as Vice-Chancellor. I also want to acknowledge my father, Ray Marginson, who's sitting in the front row, and I think some of what I say is what he also thinks. We're reasonably close now on most of these issues, especially the larger public policy ones. Well, to the answer to the question. In his biography of Pansy Wright, Peter McPhee, and it's a fine book and I commend it to you, said that one of the sharpest characteristics of Wright's generation as it emerged from World War II was its grasp of the importance of science, but also the way that was rivalled by a fierce national identity. And Wright's emphatic individuality, he was a most extraordinary person, extremely intelligent and extremely individual in style and utterly informal. And I met him enough times to have a sense of what Peter was talking about in the biography. Wright's emphatic individuality, his determination to make his own rules, was, as the former Governor-General Ninian Stevens said at the funeral, directed to unselfish ends. And as McPhee and Stuart McIntyre's history of post-war reconstruction shows, Wright and Coombs and Conlon and the other intellectuals of the Reconstruction generation made a modern university system, and in doing so helped to modernise a nation. I can think of no finer calling than those two things taken together. And that brings me straight to my theme this evening, or rather twin themes, which are Australia and the universities. In the question, how good are Australian universities, there are other questions inside. How good are the universities in relation to what? To other universities abroad? To themselves as themselves, for Australia? How good do they help to make Australia? We might say that the strengths and weaknesses of Australian universities are the strengths and weaknesses of Australia, though they must be the same, but not necessarily. It's not that easy. Though a university is conditioned by its society and nation in fundamental ways, it also has roots in worldwide knowledge conversation and in the larger international community. It's not wholly contained by the nation. Universities can move out ahead up to a point, and we often want them to do so. And they inhabit the territory of the imagination, which in a sense has no final border. Why does it matter how good the universities are? Well, I think most of us here would agree that universities have become central to the country and to the world, to all modernised countries anyway. Citadels of science, makers of society, shapers of lives, or so it seems. University has become a large and complex institution with thickening connections into the economy, government, civil society and family. The university is also multiple, if not fragmented, as Clark Kerr famously argued. Every faculty, every researcher, each interest group are on their autonomous trajectories, or so it seems. What holds it all together? Some say the Vice-Chancellor or the Dean. Others say the global discipline, but there are many of those. I think universities are unified by two heterogeneous qualities that this clever, self-perpetuating institution brought together in medieval Europe: knowledge and social weight, or gravitas. I mean, the sociologists would say status. Now, what is Australia? And what are the Australian universities? In cultural matters, The 1960s are the decade on which everything turns. The most insightful book about Australia is Donald Horne's The Lucky Country, published in 1964. A bestseller. Not bad for a book about ideas, in which the main idea was that the reader had no mind. He wrote about a half-formed national sensibility, transferred from Britain, yet out of sorts when it went back to London, oblivious of its geographical location in Asia, on which its whole future was going to turn. Still clutching the White Australia policy, which Horne, when he took over the Bulletin, campaigned against. Horne said that Australia has not been a country of great innovation or originality. It improvises well when it's pushed, but has exploited the innovations and originality of others. Dependent, second-hand, second-rate. It's one of the memorable sentences in the book. Australia was also profoundly rejective of ideas and intellectualism and intellectuals. Horne's explanation for Australian anti-intellectualism had two strands, and this might still be relevant. First, Australians had a deeply inlaid scepticism. He said it was a philosophy of life, deeply felt, widely shared. It made them practical, less prone to self-delusion, and notoriously Philistine. The instinct of the Australian was to ridicule authority and any claim to distinction or even complexity. Second, Australians also had a passion for egalitarianism that translated not into wanting everyone to be clever, but into dislike of cleverness with its power to calibrate the group. But this meld of scepticism and egalitarianism was the problem. This led Australians to hide their own talents, to frustrate talent in others, to distrust experts, and to oversimplify even the simplest issues. And there I see echoes of the present. Talented Australians, said Horne, had to appear ordinary, just like everybody else. Or they were stigmatised, not practical. Except sometimes, he said, in the arts and the sciences, where achievement was honoured. Now, science was a partial exception to this harsh verdict. The universities were not. Humanities, he said, were not invigorating in Australia. The middle ranges are adequate, but there's nothing much at the top. Australia produced the smallest proportion of science and engineering graduates among the prosperous nations. There are many Australians who know how to conduct research. Many of the best go overseas. R&D spending is abysmally low, although he did add the kind of ironic footnote, but at least it's 3 times that of Ghana. Horne knew less about universities and research than he knew about media, society, politics and public life. And the very time he was writing, in fact, the universities were expanding rapidly, taking in many more students, and research in medicine and other fields was beginning to flourish. Yet Horne's larger argument is not easy to dismiss. Intellectuals, he said, as a strong and publicly influential type of person, do not exist. Australia largely lacked the public sphere, in the sense of Jürgen Habermas, the network of critical intellectuals, interest groups and strategic thinkers at the edge of the state. The absence of the public sphere left a gulf between the campus and government. And in government, said Horne, the sense of the possible is very narrow. And I see that echo too. Horne, I think, was largely right at the time. The question is, how much is he still right? In a forthcoming book on Australian higher education, Glenn Davis describes the start of Sydney and Melbourne. Self-governing under the colonial state. Secular, comprehensive of the disciplines, not scholastic, preparing professionals. Utilitarian, like the temper of the colonies themselves. More influenced by London and Scotland than by Oxford and Cambridge. These foundations set the achievement of Australian universities and their limit. For though the 2 young universities had their shaky moments, their design was to take root and spread, and for the next century, the successive foundations around the country repeated these core features time and time again with a few nuances here and there. The outcome of this determined path dependency was a national system with remarkable homogeneity. The next key moment in the making of the Australian university was a century later, in Wright's time, the system building era, from the late 1950s to the 1970s. Universities were lifted from small enclaves, finishing schools for a fraction of the middle class, into the mass educators and the research laboratories they are today. To the founding template, the system building years added accumulation of numbers, of functions, of resources, of prestige. The rubric of never-ending growth. Like Australian native flora, with no size limits, spreading upwards and outwards to fill the empty spaces on the map. Growth confirmed the founding template, the comprehensive structure. And at this time, Wright was an instigator at a succession of key historical moments. In 1954, he suggested to Menzies that the Prime Minister establish a commission of inquiry into the universities. He may have not been the only one, but that sentence in Peter McPhee's biography jumped out at me, because that was a decisive moment in the Commonwealth's move into university policy, the Murray Report. Wright co-wrote Melbourne's submission. The final report emphasised the resource needs of faculties of medicine. With Coombs and others, he started the ANU, designed as the national research hub and graduate school with a medical institute at its heart, and originally that was the sole research function, the medical institute. He was the first chair at Peter McCullum. He met with Coombs and three donors in 1959 to start Florey. Unlike McFarlane-Burnett, he saw no tension between funding research in the university departments and the flourishing of the institutes. All had their place. A decade later, Labor's modernising Minister John Dawkins took the founding template with its larger universities and entrenched and enlarged it further with size targets and mergers, also turning the Australian university into a competitive corporation. Small specialists and colleges of advanced education now vanished. So the process of homogenisation was complete. The new element, which was significant and a source of some diversity offshore, was fee-paying international students. The system building 1960s and 1970s also began the process of continuous transformation of the universities that has pulsated through them ever since. Australia enrolled 1.4 million students in 2015, including 363,000 international students. Massive 26% of all enrolments, although a rather smaller proportion of the onshore enrolment. Universities received almost 27 billion in income. Funding per student in Australia was actually at the highest level it's been since the early 1990s. But since then, I think there's been a partial shift from teaching to research within total budgets, and probably the corporate functions have grown as a percentage of the budget as well. So not as much in the classroom or in the laboratory as there was in per student sense in the early 90s. In 2015, 42% of the income of Australian universities was from government sources. That proportion stayed fairly constant for almost 2 decades. Grants based on student fees in the tuition loan system, plus other student fees, now outweigh the Commonwealth and state contributions at 44%, and of this a remarkable 20% is from international students, 5.3 billion. Bureau of Statistics data show that in 2015-16 the total value of higher education exports, including the non-tuition spending by students and their families, comes to almost 14 billion. That's just in higher education alone. The total international export is valued at about 20 billion now. Now, the Australian university system exhibits certain distinctive structural features. First, the preponderance of degree programs relative to non-degree higher education or tertiary training. 44% of the domestic population now graduates at first degree level or above, with another 11% at sub-degree level. So still 45% who don't graduate. 44%, almost half, are graduating at the degree level. Second, Australian universities are large. none is as small as Princeton with its 8,000 students. The smallest Australian, I think it's the University of Sunshine Coast, has 12,000. And some are gigantic, almost on the scale of Toronto, and as big as the Midwest public flagships in the United States, bigger than any in the UK. Melbourne reached 58,883 students in 2015, with an international student load, full-time student load, of 15,211. Multi-campus Monash had 70,000 students, with almost 22,000 in international load. RMIT, Sydney, New South, Deakin, Queensland and Curtin in WA all exceeded 50,000 students. And there were another 6 over 40,000. My university in London, UCL, is considered very large, and it is large in feeling, at 42,000. Third, as noted, system design in Australia rests on uniformity of institutional design. Other countries have much more variety of mission. Liberal arts in the United States, high quality technical and vocational in Germany, South Korea and Taiwan, local colleges focused on teaching in many countries, specialist institutions almost everywhere. Instead of competition generating a diversity of sub-markets and debundled specialised products, as in the market imaginary, multi-purpose universities are jostling for broad market coverage at the centre of large demand pools in each state capital, in the manner of free-to-air commercial television. All the same, all black. The old path dependency and the Dawkins size formula are now locked down by economies of size and scope and a pattern of isomorphic imitation. Imitations are low risk. Innovations in mission are risky. The Melbourne model is a rare exception to this government-imposed standardisation and self-imposed standardisation. And the Melbourne model struggles to get consistent support in Canberra. It's a largely one-dimensional sector. The universities are strung out in a long vertical line, same mission but descending research intensity, resources and status. Moving down the line, the marketing claims become more hollow as value declines, though price stays the same. Fourth, whereas many other nations vigorously foster a world-class university layer, in Australian policy, regulation and funding, the top universities are somewhat flattened. The G of 8 have the first mover advantage. They're the oldest and strongest, and they concentrate much of the research capacity. They have a quarter of the student load, but they have 70% of the grants under academically competitive research funding schemes and just over half the publications. However, they have limited scope to build their position because of the fixed price character of both fees and public subsidies. They can charge higher international student fees than other universities and enrol large volume. Elite educators at home, but in dealing with international students, mass educators abroad. But this creates only a modest advantage overall, because the second tier institutions like RMIT and QUT and Curtin can also enrol very large numbers of international students. Melbourne's international competitors have better income streams. The top British research universities receive large-scale grants for research performance via what was the RAE and is now the REF. And this has been instrumental in creating effectively a world-class layer and sustaining it in the UK, or rather consolidating it, because it existed prior to the modern period. There's no extra funding attached to the equivalent, which is the ERA in Australia. It's only a status competition. Leading American universities have philanthropic funding and, of course, exceptionally strong research support in some areas. In Japan, China, Singapore, Germany and France, there's selective distribution of discrete parcels of public funding to augment research capacity and build global competitiveness. In Australia, the GO8 are able to maintain the distance down to the next tier, the Wollongongs, Newcastles, Curtins and QUTs and so on, but the G8 have limited capacity to bridge the gap with Imperial or Tokyo, which underlines the nature of the achievement of Melbourne in moving from 83 to 39 in the Shanghai Jiaotong. That's been against the grain. That's been quite an achievement. Fifth, on the other side of the coin, Australia is notable among national systems for the strength of its middle layer of universities. No less than 23 of the 40 Australian universities are in the ARWU, the Shanghai ranking top 500. That is, the G of 8 are all there, and they're all in the top 150. But there's another 15, and most of them are above the 400 level. I think only one is in the last bracket, 400 to 500. I'll show you that table later. Middle universities are pulled between the conflicting goals of building volume and trying to build selective research. Some of them have niche research profiles. Some are also attempting to build a comprehensive approach to research, although at the lowest level of citations per head. But they all benefit from the regime that's holding down the G of 8. And they're also allocated funding for research degrees and in the research infrastructure funding slightly out of, or slightly larger than they'd be strictly entitled to on a performance basis. The overall effect of all of this, and it's carefully crafted, is to maximise the number of strong, branded, income-earning universities in the global market, so 23 in the top 500. The downside is holding down the top. International comparisons are a useful discipline for us, I think. In corporate-minded universities, there's always the danger that you'll start to believe your own marketing. The road to hubris is paved by focus groups. Realistic comparisons foster humility, which is the beginning of wisdom. Comparison does not mean imitation. It merely helps us to know where we're located. Well, first, let's look at system and structure, and I've just been discussing that in the Australian context. There's no other higher education system in which there's only one basic mission and institutional shape. Australia avoids the extremes of quality in the market-diverse American system. The top in Australia is weaker, but the lower reaches, the lower 98% perhaps, is considerably stronger in Australia. 2/3 of higher education enrolments in Australia are in the world top 500 universities. In California, only 12.5% of the public system enrolments are in the doctoral universities. On the other hand, quality in Australia is less uniformly good than in the strong West European systems such as Germany, Netherlands, Switzerland and the Nordics. In the Dutch system, every research university is good. They're all incidentally ranked. There's no tail. There's a second sector, which is a teaching-only sector and is also good at what it does and well supported on the whole. Now, there's no top 50 university in Holland. Utrecht has been beetling along rather lazily, in fact, although it's still probably the primary research university. Now, some might see the lack of a top 50 university in Holland as a trade-off for the system's virtues. I don't think so. The point is not that Dutch quality is uniform. It isn't, but the floor is high. So the universities are unequivocally real universities. Now, it is possible to combine this high floor of quality with a top 20 university, and I think Germany, with the Excellence Initiative, is heading in that direction longer term. Participation. Well, in international terms, Australia is a high participation country. Participation rate of the 20 to 24 year age group was 59% in 2015 compared to the OECD's average 42%. But the participation rate is boosted by Australia's large international student population, which adds about 16% of the rate of first degrees. So that brings Australia back to just over the OECD average. But in the older age groups, over 30, Australia has the highest participation rate of any OECD country. Most of those people, though, have already done higher education previously. Most of them have graduated, in fact. Funding. Student tuition fees in Australia are less than those levied in the UK, but higher than in the public sector in the US and China, and much higher than the whole of Europe. Tuition's free in the Nordic countries and Germany, and very low in France. Fortunately for Australians, as in the UK, there's no charge at the point of entry, because fees are covered by income contingent loans underwritten by the government that are repaid through the tax system only when the income reaches a threshold level. And this protects access and also subsidises the low income earner, the pro bono lawyer, and the woman who leaves the workforce to have children. if you don't pay back your debt in your lifetime, you suffer no penalty. Internationalisation. Australia has higher than average levels of international co-publication. Not much higher though. Australian researchers have especially frequent partnerships in publication with researchers in New Zealand most of all, and South Africa, Singapore, the UK, China and Taiwan. Science in Australia has a much stronger relationship with science in China than is the case for British science, interestingly. British science has gone to Europe. Who knows what will happen in the future. The internationalisation of students, though, is more lopsided for Australia. The OECD measures stays of 1 year or more for study purposes. Now, Australia's number coming in is comparatively high. The number going out is exceptionally low. In terms of incoming students in 2015, 14% at bachelor level and 43% at master's level and 34% at doctoral level were international. In Australia, international students were 51% concentrated in business and management and law, which is an unusual level of concentration, the highest in those fields internationally, and concentration in STEM in Australia of international students is pretty low by comparison with other countries. In terms of outgoing students, only 0.7% of Australian students were enrolled abroad in 2015. Australia's ratio of incoming to outgoing students at 25 was even higher than the 21 in the United States, much the highest in the OECD. So it seems that Australian universities need to travel, as they do, but their students do not. The main opportunity for internationalisation then, in the form of mixing between students and cultures, is between the international students coming in and the local students. But all the research is telling us that local students are generally tolerant, but they keep their distance and they have no motivation to open up culturally or to learn new languages. Research. The ranking of Australian universities in the ARWU, which is the only really credible ranking among the large prominent rankings, shows the country punching above its weight in the top 500 and top 100, but not in the top 40. The ARWU measures research citations, publications and Nobels. That's the only thing it measures. Leiden University ranking provides data on published papers between 2012 and 2015, 4 years of the last collection has up to 2015 and 4 years of publishing. And it looks at the number of papers each university has in the top 10% by citation in the field. And that's not a bad measure, I think, of science power, sort of the quantity and quality work, if you like. Now, on that, using that measure, number of high citation papers, Melbourne produced 1,518 such papers in the 4 years, and that put it 31st in the world. So I think it's in some ways a better measure than the ARWU, which is somewhat affected by the Nobel indicator. A fast rising Queensland has got to 38 on that high cite papers measure. Sydney is hanging in there at 41. Monash has got to 62, an enormous change from when I was at Monash a decade ago. And New South Wales has also come up to 65. ANU, well down because it's a smaller institution, partly also because there's been a drop-off in its relative research performance. Given size and historical factors, useful public university comparatives for an aspirant Melbourne with its 1,518 papers might be Toronto, UCL, Wisconsin-Madison, UBC in Canada, National University of Singapore, a very interesting comparator, and UC Davis, which is a large UC. Harvard's 7,134 papers, more than double Stanford #2, is mind-blowing. Any global university ranking that says Harvard is not the world's leading university either thinks that research is not the primary indicator or is working to very tailored and limited criteria of some kind, or, like the Times Higher and the QS, is playing commercial games with the sector. And the Times Higher's managed to elevate Cambridge and Oxford to the top 2 positions after strenuous efforts over the years to confirm that UK higher education really is #1 in the world. I mean, my point though is that the Australian universities are not Annapurnas. You know, they're not quite in this league. At discipline level, Australia's strong meta cluster is life and medical sciences. In biomedical and health, Melbourne is at 22nd in the world with 909 high citation papers, 22nd. And that's up from 33rd 6 years before. So Melbourne's on the upward trajectory in biomedical and health disciplines. Sydney's at 27 in biomedical and health, Queensland's at 46, and Monash has got to 62. In life and earth sciences, Queensland does even better. It's at 11th place in the world. Melbourne's at 40, ANU 48, UWA 57, and James Cook, with its specialisation in tropical and marine, is at 58. Australia does less well on the physical sciences, STEM disciplines, and in maths and computing, where New South Wales is the strongest, and it's in the 60s or 80s in each case. In 2014, towards the end of his time as chief scientist, Ian Chubb, whose informality, prolific swearing and highly successful crash-through style recalled R Douglas Wright, published a report that benchmarked Australian science and engineering, including life and medical, on citation performance relative to a group of 15 top European systems and the United States. The data includes CSIRO in the Australian figures, and that makes a considerable difference, I might say. Between 2002 and 2012, Australia produced 3.1% of the world's publications in the science fields. Looking at the top 1% by citation rate, the very strongest papers in terms of citation, Australia produced 9% of those papers in earth and planetary science, 8% in agriculture and biological sciences, 7% in environmental sciences, 7% in veterinary, 6% in medicine, and 5% in immunology and microbiology. So medicine and immunology, microbiology performing at about double the expected rate, showing how strong those concentrations are, as also the case for the other disciplines I've named. Australia's citation rate was higher than average for the 15 strong EU countries in just 4 fields: earth sciences, physical sciences, mathematical sciences, and the biomedical and clinical health sciences. In 6 other fields, the Australian citation rate was above the world average but below the EU 15. So more below than above these strong European systems. It's not a stellar outcome. I mean, Sweden and the UK were above the EU 15 average in all the fields. Canada in nearly all of them, and the United States as well. I mean, Chubb was moved to be was relatively critical. But, you know, a report that says this is where we're at, as opposed to aren't we wonderful, was hardly noticed. International comparisons are not the only standard of value, so the thing must be good in itself. How good is the Australian university in itself? What we might call the inner university. And how good is the Australian university for the society in which it sits, the outer university? Well, the inner and outer universities, of course, are not wholly separate. The inner university is partly shaped by its management. In turn, management is much affected by government, by the lattice of laws, rules, capital flows, distributional formulae, parcels of money, visa decisions, and all the rest of the dense lattice in which the university is embedded. Government is a more complete presence in the Australian university than it is in, say, the American university. Australia is more British than American in its relationship with the state. The state manager nexus was fundamental to the development of a more professional academic management during the new public management reforms of the 1990s. In the outcome, there's some pluses and minuses, but Australian universities have become better run, and I think in some places, in some cases, very well run, and in nearly all cases, well run. Management reform has underpinned the remarkable business success of international education and enabled universities to be efficient at a much higher level of scale, while maintaining continual structural changes and a plethora of organisational initiatives and outreach with less public money per capita. But be careful what you wish for. I think that Australian universities have become stronger in management and professional services than in their academic cultures. I think we see here traces of what Horn talked about. The practivist bias, the instinctive sidelining or hiding of the intellectual that Horn discussed. And to justify this blatant judgment, I will switch back to where I'm comfortable, which is the comparative. As I said, and there are notable exceptions to this generalisation, Australian academic cultures are not as resilient and reproductive or as intellectually energetic and exciting as academic cultures in the UK, the American doctoral sector, leading Dutch universities, or maybe even Singapore. I'm sure of this in the social sciences and humanities. It's suggested in the research citation data in some disciplines, as we've seen. And it may not be true of medicine, which is the strongest field in the country in world terms, and perhaps the one where Australia and the UK are more or less on the same plane. In Australia, disciplinary cultures are strongest in the top research universities. There, management is often more circumspect, professors who raise serious money and win major academic prizes are valued, have great autonomy, and some can almost write their own rules. But this is the triumph of the economic entrepreneur, not the college. The collective professoriate and the scholarly meeting have much more power at Cambridge and Oxford, the Ivy League and the University of California than in Australia. I think it's a succession of university leaders at UC Berkeley have torn their hair out with the power of the faculty meeting to determine appointments and let alone university strategy and budgets. What of teaching and learning? Well, Australia, like other English-speaking countries, has expanded quality assurance systems, student assessment of staff, nomination-based rewards for best teaching, certification of university teachers, research in classrooms, technology-based applications. And this has installed a reflexive culture in which improvement in learning is embedded, enabling substantial gains in medical education and elsewhere. And the ubiquitous awards maybe I'm not sure about. And there are some downsides, great inflation, and the reluctance of some academics to challenge their students intellectually in case their ratings fall. And this is becoming a research problem in the United States, and it's something we're very concerned about in the UK. But I think bad teaching is now much more likely to be spotted and acted upon. The Outer University. Well, in Wright's time, it was hoped that the growth of universities would enable the expansion of equality of opportunity across the society, implanting a more meritocratic order in which social mobility would flourish. We now know that despite the inclusive potential of growth, it's difficult to change the social balance of the enrolment. You can increase the absolute number of people from bottom quintile or bottom quartile families, but not necessarily their proportionate share, and certainly not in the high demand, highly selective top research universities. In each phase of expansion, the middle class proves to make the best use of the new opportunities. In the last decade, despite rapid growth before and after the open demand-driven enrolment system started in 2012, the share of students from the bottom socioeconomic status quartile has moved modestly from 16 to 18%, and there's a concentration of those students in lower status and lower resourced institutions. The rate of inclusion of Indigenous students is about half its share of the Australian population. In the G of 8 in 2014, only 11% of students were from the bottom quartile. The high-fee independent schools remain the royal road to academic success, blocking the potential for broader mobility. Equity is important, but it's hard to progress. And it's hard in every society. Even in the Nordic countries, there's a frustration that this high social commitment to equality, fundamental value across the societies, and these universal high-quality education systems are not leading to an improvement in distribution of income or reproduction of social rewards. They're just holding the line. But equity is not the only public good produced by universities, although it dominates the discussion. Much of the larger contribution is expressed through the disciplines. Horn might have been pleased with the growth of enrolments in STEM. Universities' larger contribution to scientific literacy is crucial. The RAND Corporation's The Global Technology Revolution 2020 found that Australia had an excellent capacity to acquire all of the 16 report's chosen technologies. Earnings to science degrees are not as high as for the science-based professions, but employment rates are excellent. The social sciences are more heterogeneous. They are mostly developed to provide data and advice for government, and their larger potential contribution happens when an activist government is in power, like the 40s, like the mid-70s and so on. And then they're asked to work on larger projects, such as inequality and poverty, black deaths in custody, or the stolen generation. And when governmental torpor sets in, as at present, the social sciences look more fragmented, even trivial. However, there's little the social sciences can do, or the university for that matter, to wake a sleeping government. The problem apparent in Horn's time, the absence of a larger public sphere around government which might debate and rework and transmit ideas from the universities or elsewhere into government, in some measure continues. The vacuum around government also protects the narrowness of the public agenda discussed by Horn, which also seems to continue. Government is freed from potential obligation to address a larger set of policy concerns. Discussion of ideas in the media, which is the nominal public sphere, I guess, mostly takes a shadow ideological and combative tone, as if question time in Parliament has been carried into the larger public space. Almost before a new issue appears, it's simplified and arranged into a left-right polarity, like a tennis match where the sole meaning is to determine the winner. There's little space there for specialised knowledge, few points of entry for university-based intellectuals. Horn argued in relation to national identity that Australians knew that they were no longer truly British, but the momentum towards concepts of independent nationhood had slowed down or stopped. That rings a bell. Also, Horn said they need to discover that they're in Asia. Horn stated that the focus on Asia could unlock Australia's stuck-in-transition national identity. That's a prescient overall assessment, I think. Of course, some matters have changed since the lucky country, but perhaps the imperatives have increased. The geostrategic weight of Asia has certainly increased, specifically China, but also South Korea, the most dynamic economy of 50 million people. And you can see the others coming up as well. Taiwan, even Vietnam, Malaysia, despite its problems. Of course, Singapore. The White Australia policy has been dismantled since Horn, and the demography is being transformed. And Australia's three major sources of migrants, which are about equally weighted, with one or another number one in successive quarters, are China, India and UK Ireland. National engagement with Asia has vastly expanded on many fronts, with the universities playing a key part. Now let's consider for a moment the rise of Asia, especially China. Global power is becoming more plural. China surpassed the purchasing power GDP of the United States in 2014-15. Aggregate R&D spending in East Asia exceeded the North American level 5 years ago. Consider also the quickening expansion of the middle class in East, Southeast and South Asia. Grass and Gertz Brookings estimate that it was 1.9, the middle class globally was 1.9 billion in 2009 and will rise to 3.3 billion in 2020. That's 3 years' time. Most of the growth will occur in China, India and Indonesia, which is often forgotten, but it's the fourth largest country in population terms, and it's growing at 6% a year in terms of the economy. In 2015, Australia had 107,000 international students from China, 33,000 from India, 32,000 from Singapore, 29,000 from Malaysia and 19,000 from Vietnam. The projected growth of the Asian middle class means that on the demand side, international students in Australia will continue to grow. numbers will fall only if there's a change on the supply side, for example, a policy reduction of student visas. Consider also the scale and speed of the growth of science in China, the graph. The annual number of published papers rose from 66,000 in 2005 to 257,000 in 2014. 9 years multiplied by 4 times. China's output moved from 25% of the American level. 9 years later, it was 80% of the American level. And it will soon pass the US in terms of volume of science. The number of universities from mainland China in the ARWU Top 500 has gone up from 8 in 2005 to 45 in 2017. From 8 to 45 in a 12-year period. But this, I think, is the one that gets to me. Quality is improving at the same time as quantity. The table lists the leading universities in the physical sciences side of STEM. This has been a priority in East Asia, in the emerging East Asian research systems, the physical sciences side of STEM. And again, here we're using the measure number of papers published in 2012 to 15 in the top 10% of their field, high citation science. China had more than half of the top 15 universities in mathematics and complex computing. Tsinghua was well ahead in first place. Singapore's Nanyang was second. The highest placed American university, MIT, was 5th. Physical sciences and engineering show the US is still stronger with those top 2 places, but both China and the US have 5 of the top 15. Note that the 2 Singapore universities are in the top 15 in both clusters. Has the world shifted and changed recently? You bet. When the 2 columns are aggregated, Tsinghua just shades MIT as the world's top STEM university in the physical sciences. That was the objective. China has very nearly caught up overall in STEM at this top level, and with its researchers publishing in a second language. However, China is not nearly as strong in biological sciences and medicine, although biological sciences research is increasing at a rapid rate. Of universities from the English-speaking countries, the Australians were the first into China, and some have developed formidable practical expertise. Large initiatives such as the combined Monash South Eastern University Graduate School and the University of New South Wales Torch Project, supported by the Chinese government, will have long-term effects. In their work in the Asian region, the universities have moved out ahead of Australia, and in turn they've helped to bring Australia along. The university's Asian engagement is also subject to some of the same limitations as Australia's general relationship with the region. There are tendencies to focus on short-term returns, not on long-term relationships, to see East Asia as a commercial opportunity without regard for the cultural engagement that goes with that, and to underestimate the importance of learning Asian languages, especially with not only Putonghua, and much of the hard work clearly is still ahead. The long-term encounter and hybridisation between the Chinese civilisational zone and the Anglo-American European zone is the main vector in which the future world society will emerge. India will also play a role which is not yet clear. Australia's own Europe-Asia tension and the pathway to its resolution are a subset of this larger problem. Some of the issues are arising earlier here. That's a potential advantage. The East-West sensibility that Australians acquire could equip them to play a larger global role if they do engage effectively in East Asia and build a partly hybridised outlook. The universities are essential to that kind of national project. But do the universities contain sufficient originality and independence of thought to contribute to a new kind of nation at the forefront of historical change? That's how good Australia needs its universities to be. Geography will be decisive in the long run. In summary, how good are Australian universities? Well, they're large, often multi-site, comprehensive and internally diverse. This allows them to take on multiple roles. They're very good at managing large international student intakes from Asia, at least on the services side. The educational side is less clear. Some Australian universities have developed deeper expertise in relation to China. On the whole, Australian universities are very well led and managed, or well led and managed, and tend to make the most of their capacity, insofar as universities will ever do that. Australia has 23 universities in the world top 500, exceptional given the size of the country. There's a large, robust group of second-tier universities that bring research-informed degrees to a broad segment of the Australian population. The universities harbour pockets of high global excellence in certain subfields and research, including plant and animal research, where CSIRO is also an important player, medicine, related biological sciences and earth sciences. Field-by-field citation quality is less consistent than in Canada, the UK and the smaller systems in northwestern Europe. The weaker features of Australian universities are the reverse of the strengths. Outgoing student mobility is abysmal, and the ratio of incoming to outgoing students the highest in the OECD. The uniformity in institutional mission, structure and culture, though similar to Australian public provision in other spheres, is unique in the higher education world. The absence of diversity, particularly specialist public institutions, must be considered a serious weakness. Market competition and government policy and regulation both foster uniformity. In addition, the system settings flatten the leading universities somewhat. Australia has just one top 40 university and it's just snuck in to the top 40. Below the large middle group in the second tier, there's a long tail of institutions that are nominally research universities but have modest evidence for the claim. On the whole, in comparative terms, academic cultures in Australian universities may be less strong than university management and professional services. All is not well either in the broader context of the universities. Horne's 1964 charge that Australia lacks originality and creativity in many domains and has no respect for talent has become lacks sufficient originality, creativity and respect for talent. Some of the cultural blockages Horne identified are partly still there. There's not enough regard for intellectual achievement in the broader community. Strident American anti-science politics are unlikely to gain traction in Australia. The problem rather is marginalisation and indifference. The public sphere surrounding government, the sphere of intelligent discussion and debate about matters of science, policy and the public interest, is underdeveloped by comparison with, say, the United States, UK and parts of Western Europe. This inhibits the potential for autonomous Australian intellectual culture and limits the scope for universities and their people to exercise strong agency in government. Though universities make many contributions to government on a day-to-day basis at an instrumental level, there are invisible barriers to deeper influence, except perhaps in relation to Australia's engagement with Asia. If the larger public sphere is successfully fostered, then the conditions will open up. The solution is not more university marketing at the public, which can appear inauthentic. It's pursuing authentic content-related agendas cleverly so as to gain traction in an arid public setting. The universities must persist with contributions based on knowledge and expertise, because that's what they do. At the same time, there are issues of values that need to be addressed. Though the universities are connected to society at many points, public policy and university discourse now place undue emphasis on the contributions of universities in the form of private benefits to selected individuals. I believe more attention should be given to the broader public goods that universities create. To the conclusion, R Douglas Wright and Donald Horne each supplied the Australian universities with one of the two strategic tools they need to lift themselves, to lift their contributions to Australia, and thereby lift Australia and lift its contribution to the world. Horne said, engagement with Asia will be the creative, liberating element in Australia, the source of a new and more confident national project. Wright's vision was about the university as a self-governing centre of untrammelled debate and the role of the intellectual in contributing to the quality of citizenship in the country. He saw the university as a distinctive community, quote, based on freedom of inquiry, but with special social responsibilities. If Australian universities can get the freedom right and the social responsibilities right and Asia right, that might be enough. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Simon, for a masterful lecture. There are few who know Australian universities so well, both from the inside and the outside, and now, of course, you have the privilege of looking at it from a distance. So thank you very much for that, but I must say that I was particularly struck that not only you gave us a masterful thesis on where the Australian universities stand, but how masterfully you wove it into the lives and thoughts of Pansy Wright. So thank you so much, because that makes that lecture particularly special. So we've got a wonderful audience here, and I'm sure many have questions, and we do have time for some. So there's a mic somewhere. There's supposed to be a mic somewhere, so if you could just raise your hand if you have a question, we'll get a mic coming to you. There we go. Professor Terry Nolan.
Thanks very much. Wonderful presentation. And your concluding remarks included the statement that greater attention needs to be paid to the public good that universities represent. This is reflected in the REF and now in Australia in measuring societal benefit from research impact in Australia for the first time ever. International ratings and rankings are still very internally faced in terms of the parameters that they're measuring and so forth. And I wonder if it's a fundamentally flawed metric by which we are making those comparisons, because we are not yet fully measuring what really does matter, and that is the difference that the activities that universities generate through their research and engagement that really does make some major contribution to the community. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think that we've got ourselves into a certain amount of trouble with the way in which we're assessing university performance and the way in which we're informing the public about the resources, capacities and qualities and outcomes of universities. Because the ranking systems are either narrowly focused or they're incoherent, illogical and invalid. I mean, those that combine using weighted indicators, combine a whole lot of heterogeneous qualities into a single number and rank are just nonsense intellectually. And I've spent the last 10 years or so campaigning against them without a great deal of success, I might say. But you know, mixing subjective indicators like survey results with measures of materiality like numbers of students or dollars through the door. But I think the arbitrary weightings is the major problem. You only have to change the weighting slightly and get quite different results in the middle level, for example. You don't necessarily change the top 10, but you'll certainly change places 40 to 100. And I mean, I've reached the conclusion that no multi-indicator ranking is ever going to be a useful idea. But I think that having rankings of separate indicators is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Like rankings on number of research papers tell you something about the size of the university and its areas of work, for example. And it's just simply a way of getting that information. The problem comes when you combine these different single indicators into a combined indicator. But I'm comfortable with the good research data. So I like the Leiden ranking and use it a lot because it doesn't combine different heterogeneous qualities. It just uses single measures like top 10% publications in number and according to discipline field. It field weights carefully. It's very responsible. And you can use the Scopus collection just like you can use the Web of Science collection to extract those kinds of useful performance indicators. And so we know quite a lot about research now that we didn't know. And I think having the research data, comparative data, has driven a tremendous upsurge of investment in R&D, especially university basic science. That's been a great boon. I mean, the research systems are all heading towards application, commercialisation, without much regard for the basic fields. In some disciplines, that's a significant problem. But the emphasis on scientific journal publication has brought attention back to the core disciplines. And they seem to also be given a certain amount of status within ranking systems. So that's helped us a very good deal, I think. But there really aren't many other areas where the comparative information works very well across borders and between disciplines. I mean, research is a world system in the scientific disciplines, but really nothing else that we do is so neatly compared. And there is the point that you made, I think, that there are no indicators that point to the broader public role of for example, the role in relation to participation or inclusion. That, it seems to me, is an important role. The proportion of students who come from the bottom quintile, for example, as an indicator used a lot in the United States, which is quite relentless on those issues. You'd like to see those sort of data being collected. I mean, the difficulty with the public good role is that many of the big collective goods like literacy or culture or civilisation don't, while they're there and it's real, they don't lend themselves to metrics, and certainly comparative metrics. But it is an issue which I'm actively working on. That's, you know, how you measure and compare those larger outputs, and it's certainly one where I'd hope to have something to say in a couple of years' time.
Any other questions that you might have? Yes, could we have the mic over here? You know, while the mic gets to you, you're probably quite right in telling us that any of these simple ranking systems that a lot of these publications generate, and one has to remind ourselves that one of the first ranking systems that came out was US World and News in the US, and it was largely to help mothers choose between colleges for their children. So that is a role that these rankings play. People choose where to go for their undergraduate education. So what would you think, whether these rankings, one, serve that purpose?
No, I think that the individual indicators are often very important and helpful. I just spoke to the conference of the Complete Universities Guide in the UK, which was set up not by commercial ranking company or public or news magazine. It was established by people who were careers advisors who wanted to inform parents and students better. And they collected indicators in a whole range of areas which are quite pertinent. The problem then became that they put them into a combined weighting, and inevitably Cambridge and Oxford came out on top. So, you know, the world was kept secure. But in my keynote to the conference last week, I made the point that I think if you just look at the separated indicators on the website, and they're very accessible, it's a great data set. And they all agreed with me, but their parent company, because they've sold themselves to a commercial firm, doesn't want them to give up the league table of the best university combined kind. And that's the difficulty, because that gross simplification has captured people. It's very difficult to unwind that, but we're working on it.
Very well. We have a question there. Oh, a question
Yeah.
there, and then a question there.
Yeah, my question, Simon, is about intellectual good, not public good, but intellectual good. And particularly coming back to your last set of tables about the single measure performance on high citation publications. And I guess the ultimate, I've got a comment, but the question really is, what would it take for a single Australian university to at least match the performance of the National University of Singapore?
That's the good comparison, isn't it, Peter? Yeah.
It is. And I just got a comment and I'll let you answer the question. The comment was when I was listening to your paper, excellent paper I have to say, I was thinking about poor old Isaac Newton, who made a real contribution to science. And he used to roll up to his lectures and there was never anybody in his lectures. The reason was that students certainly didn't understand the scientific paradigm that he was working with, because he was inventing new knowledge, genuine, profound new knowledge. And I guess related to my question is, could you ever imagine now, after what Australian universities have been through in the last 20 or 30 years, a university in Australia that would be hospitable to a person like Isaac Newton?
Well, I mean, it's a very good point, and the empty Newton lectures are great to me too, aren't they? And you know, Pansy Wright, there's a related problem, which is the assessment of teaching, and I mean, he gave these challenging lectures where, as David Pennington says, and as quoted in Peter McPhee's book, they made you think for yourself. That was the whole purpose of his teaching. And there were a group of students who were very stimulated, and there were others who were offended, and many who didn't understand. And his teaching assessments would have been very polarised, and he would not have survived a confrontation with his head of department, and would have done his best to remain head of department purely to protect himself. I mean, you know, we have a fundamental problem that we have ironed out all the edgy bits, all the things which are unclear, uncertain, and can't be readily resolved on the spot, and packaged neatly, are now inhibited. And I think the point about, what we can do in universities, it seems to me, is create more research only or scholarly only positions, because that should be part of the apparatus of appointment. But Singapore, I don't know whether Singapore is going that way, but I think it would like to. There's tremendous respect in Singapore and in China too for fundamental discovery, and that's why Shanghai Jiatong put the Nobel indicator in there into their ranking, because they wanted to give respect to that and also to encourage the emulation of that idea. Singapore's virtue, it seems to me, is that they spot talent and they appoint talent. They're just ruthless about that, and they're quite right about that. As you've said repeatedly in your outstanding work on the university, the creative class is a small group, and we need to put that at the centre of the equation and not assume that everyone should be behaving the same way, or has the same ability, or will produce the same things. And it's essential to protect those who produce the major work, and surround them with conditions which are different, if necessary, to those of others. So I agree with the need to differentiate, and it's good that Cambridge was so slack and badly managed that it didn't attend to Newton's performance.
Perhaps last question there, and then we have to end. I have a request for Richard to come. If you could please introduce yourself.
I'm Ian Blair, I'm an agriculturalist. Great talk. You only mentioned, I think, once technology in teaching, and I'm wondering, you really emphasised China and India, and I grew up in India. India has 150 million students to train in agriculture in the next 10 years, because they're losing 2,000 farmers a day out of it. So you didn't mention MOOC, massive online open courses. What role do you see that in the future to get through these massive numbers? China's moving 70 million farmers off the land to eliminate rural poverty and then resurveying the land.
Yes,
so
the scale of all that is just
how are we, Australia, because we've got from the tropics down to mild temperate, we can provide the technology and the expertise to do it?
I think that I was persuaded of the impact of potential impact of technology when I learned a little bit about what medical education in Australia and Canada were doing 15 years ago. And you can see that its relationship with what you might call the face-to-face associational organic classroom is also important, though. And I think that I'm not an expert on MOOCs, but I've observed and followed. And it seems to me that they do have an important role, but it's not quite as transformative as some people thought it might be, as a sort of large-scale substitute for institutional education. We know a lot about learning. We don't know nearly enough. There are many mysteries, but we do know that it's an associational process, and that it depends at certain times, at certain phases, on both interaction between peers and interaction with those mentors and teachers who know more and can assist the learning process. So in the end, if you rely solely on electronic transmission, it's not going to be enough. But the point about the scale of transformation in the going from a Neolithic economy to a capitalist economy in India is, it's still only 30% urbanised. India, there's still an enormous number of people in the countryside. In China, Indonesia have got to the 50% urbanisation already, but India's got a long way to go, and this is going to drive the world in many ways, this transformation in India. And the transformation from small farms to agribusiness, the level of technology and knowledge of chemicals and other science required rapidly at scale. I think Australians have got a great opportunity to play a role there. Absolutely right. We do know a lot about distance, and we know a lot about educational and learning technologies, But you know, I don't think you can ever forget the eye contact and the handshake.
Well, that's a wonderful note on which to end. I would just like to add that our Australian High Commissioner to India was visiting the university 2 weeks ago, and that was one of the big things she saw as an opportunity, though she didn't think we were exploiting it as yet. So it's perhaps an invitation to do so. But let me take a moment to thank you not only for the lecture and the question answer, and invite Richard for a formal vote of thanks, and then the presentation of the RD Wright Lecture.
Well, what an insight into Simon's stunning capacity. Simon prepares wonderfully original papers for every single occasion which he speaks, and we've seen that again this evening. But the stunning insight for me is how beautifully Simon has dealt with some hugely complex questions from you, and that shows us the breadth and depth of his intellect and his insights. Simon once again has straddled history, sociology, politics and geography. He's been provocative as always, and occasionally a little bit combative. We love all of it, Simon, so thank you for what has been a real treat this evening. Satish, can I thank you and your colleagues in the faculty for the wisdom to invite Simon to present the RD Wright Lecture. I can only hope that Pansy Wright would be thrilled by the intellectual character of Simon's work and the way he's taken on some very, very challenging issues for higher education, not only in Australia, but across the globe. But Simon, there is a marvellous medallion as a memento for you. Thank you so much for your lecture this evening and being with us once again. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the lecture, and I thank you all for attending.